And now, Tobias Mindernickel.
One of the streets, climbing rather steeply from Wharf Way up to the central part of town, is called Grey Road. About halfway along this street, and to the right, if you're coming from the river, stands number 47, a drab, narrow building, utterly indistinguishable from its neighbors. The ground floor contains a grocery where you can also buy galoshes and castor oil. If, glancing into a courtyard where cats scurry about, you cross the vestibule, a worn and narrow staircase, smelling unspeakably dank and squalid, leads to the upper stories. On the second floor, a cabinet maker lives to the left, a midwife to the right. On the third floor there is a cobbler to the left, and on the right a lady who starts singing loudly the instant footsteps are heard on the stairs. On the fourth floor, the left-hand apartment is vacant. The right-hand one is occupied by a man named Mindernickel, and Tobias to boot. And there is a story about this man, a story that has to be told because it is enigmatic and inconceivably shameful. Mindernickel's appearance is striking, bizarre, and ridiculous. For example, if he decides to take a walk and you see his scrawny figure propped on a cane trudge up the street, then he is dressed in black, and from head to foot at that. He wears a shabby, old-fashioned top hat with a curving brim, a tight Prince Albert shiny with age, and equally shabby trousers frayed at the bottom and so short that you can see the rubber inserts of the ankle boots. Incidentally, it must be said that this clothing is brushed as clean as can be. His scraggy neck seems all the longer for protruding from a low Byron collar. His grey hair is brushed smooth and deep into his temples, and the wide brim of the top hat shades a wan, clean-shaven face with hollow cheeks, inflamed eyes that seldom rise from the ground, and two deep creases that run morosely from the nose to the drooping corners of the mouth. Mindernickel rarely leaves his home, and there is a reason for this. You see, the moment he shows up on the street, a mob of children comes running. They follow him for a good distance, laughing, jeering, singing, "Ho, ho, Tobias," and probably tugging at his coat, while people emerge in their doorways and enjoy the spectacle. But he himself, unresisting and glancing shyly around, his shoulders hunched and his head poking forward, goes off like a person hurrying through a cloudburst without an umbrella. And even though the people in front of their doors are laughing in his face, he greets some of them with a humble bow. Farther on, when the children stay behind, when people no longer know him and very few give him a second glance, his manner does not change essentially. His eyes keep darting about anxiously, and he hastens along, cringing as if feeling 1,000 scornful stares. And if he raises his eyes from the ground, timidly and hesitantly, then you notice that, strangely enough, he is incapable of focusing on any person or even any object with a firm, calm look. Outlandish as it may sound, he seems to lack the natural and superior attribute of sensory perception with which the individual looks at the phenomenal world. Tobias appears to feel inferior to every phenomenon, and his unsteady eyes have to crawl on the ground before people and things. What is the matter with this man, who is always alone, and who seems uncommonly miserable? His vehemently bourgeois clothing, as well as a certain meticulous movement of his hand across his chin, seem to indicate that he absolutely refuses to be reckoned among the class of people in whose midst he lives. Goodness knows what sort of abuse he once endured. His face looks as if life itself, scornfully laughing, had punched him with all its might. Then again, it's quite possible that without having experienced any hard blows of fate, he is simply no match for life. The painful inferiority and stupidity of his appearance convey the embarrassing impression that nature has denied him the measure of strength, backbone, and equilibrium that would adequately allow him to exist with his head erect. Having taken his walk to town, Leaning on his black cane, he returns to his apartment, welcomed on Grey Road by the howling children. He walks up the dank stairs to his rooms, which are squalid and austere. Only the dresser, a solid Empire piece with heavy metal handles, has value and beauty. In front of the window, whose view is hopelessly blocked by the grey side wall of the neighboring house, there is a flower pot full of soil, but with absolutely nothing growing in it. Nevertheless, Tobias Mindernickel sometimes walks over, gazes at the flower pot, and sniffs the bare soil. And next to this parlor lies a small, dark bedroom. After entering the apartment, Tobias deposits his cane and his top hat on the table, sits down on the green sofa, which smells of dust. He props his chin on his hand, and, raising his eyebrows, stares down at the floor. There appears to be nothing left for him to do on earth. As for Mindernickel's character, it is very difficult to judge, but the following incident seems to speak in its favor. One day, when this peculiar man left his house, and, as usual, a cluster of children formed, pursuing him with derision and laughter, a boy of about 10 tripped over another boy's foot. He hit the ground so violently that blood poured from his nose and his forehead, and he lay there crying. Instantly, Tobias turned around, hurried to the fallen child, bent over him, and began commiserating with him in a mild and quavering voice. "You poor child," he said. "Did you hurt yourself? You're bleeding. Look, the blood's running from his forehead. Yes, yes, how wretchedly you're lying there. Of course it hurts so badly that he's crying, the poor child. How sorry I feel for you. It was your fault, but I'll tie my handkerchief around your head. There, there, now just pull yourself together. Now just stand up." And after saying those words, and actually tying his own handkerchief around the boy's head, he carefully helped him to his feet and trudged away. At this moment, his face and his bearing displayed a resolutely different expression than normally. His body erect, he took firm steps, and he breathed deeply under the tight Prince Albert. His eyes had widened. They were glowing and self-confidently taking in people and objects, while his mouth had a look of painful happiness. As a result of that incident, the denizens of Grey Road initially made a little less fun of him. But after a while his surprising conduct was forgotten, and a chorus of healthy, high-spirited, and cruel throats again sang behind the unsteadily cringing man, "Ho, ho, Tobias." One sunny morning at 11 o'clock, Mindernickel left his house and walked up through the entire town to Lark Hill, the long, sprawling rise that offers the finest promenade in town during the afternoon. But because of the excellent spring weather, there were already a few vehicles and pedestrians here this morning. Under a tree on the large main avenue stood a man with a young leashed hound which he showed the passers-by, his obvious intention being to sell it. The dog was a small, yellow, muscular creature about 4 months old, with one black ear and black rings around its eyes. When Tobias noticed it from a distance of 10 paces, he halted, rubbed his chin several times, and thoughtfully eyed the vendor and the little puppy which was wagging its tail alertly. Thereupon Tobias started walking again, and pressing the crook of his cane against his mouth, he circled the tree on which the man was leaning. After circling 3 times, he stepped over to him and muttered hastily with his eyes riveted on the animal, "How much do you want for this dog?" 10 marks, the man replied. Tobias was silent for an instant, and then repeated irresolutely, 10 marks? "Yes," said the man. Tobias drew a black leather purse from his pocket, removed a 5-mark bill, a 3-mark coin and a 2-mark coin, and quickly handed this money to the vendor. Then he took hold of the leash, and timidly peering about, since a few people had observed the sale and were laughing, the hunched man pulled a squealing and struggling animal along behind him. The dog resisted all the way back, digging its forelegs into the ground and anxiously and quizzically gazing up at its new master. Tobias, however, kept pulling silently and energetically, and he managed to get through town safe and sane. On Grey Road, a tremendous uproar burst out among the street boys when Tobias showed up with the dog. But he lifted it in his arms, bent over it, and with the children tugging on his coat, he hurried through the mockery and laughter up the stairs and into his apartment. Here he put the still whimpering dog on the floor, stroked it benevolently, and said patronizingly, "Now, now, you don't have to be afraid of me, animal. It's not necessary." Then from a dresser drawer he brought over a plate of cooked meat and potatoes, and tossed part of the food down for the creature, which instantly stopped its lament. Smacking its lips and wagging its tail, it devoured the meal. "By the way, I'm naming you Esau," said Tobias. "Do you understand me? Esau. I'm sure you can retain that simple sound." And pointing to the floor, he commanded, "Esau." The dog, perhaps expecting to receive more food, did indeed come over, and Tobias approvingly patted him on the side. "That's right, my friend. I can praise you." Then he stepped back a little, pointed to the floor, and commanded anew, "Esau." And the animal, which had become very frisky, sprang over again and licked its master's boot. Tobias repeated this exercise some 13 or 14 times, with inexhaustible delight in commanding. Eventually, however, Esau seemed tired. He apparently felt like relaxing and digesting, and he lay down on the floor in the graceful and intelligent posture of a hunting dog, stretching out his 2 long, finely shaped forelegs close together. "Once again," said Tobias, "Esau." But Esau turned his head aside and stayed put. "Esau," cried Tobias in a masterfully raised voice, "you have to come, even if you're tired." But Esau put his head on his paws and refused to come. "Listen," said Tobias, his tone full of dreadfully quiet menace. "Obey, or you will learn that it's not wise to annoy me." But the animal barely moved his tail. Mindernickel was seized with an immense, an excessive, an insane anger. He grabbed his black cane, pulled Esau up by his scruff, and beat the screaming little animal. Beside himself and full of indignant fury, he kept repeating over and over in a dreadful, hissing voice, "What's that? You won't obey! You have the gall not to obey me!" Eventually, Tobias flung away the stick and placed the whimpering dog on the floor. Breathing deeply, he put his hands behind his back, and taking long steps began to stride up and down in front of Esau. Occasionally he cast a proud and angry glance at him. After pacing like that for a while, he halted by the animal which was lying on his back, wagging his forelegs in a pleading fashion. Tobias folded his arms on his chest and spoke, displaying the dreadfully cold and harsh glare and tone with which Napoleon addressed the company that had lost its Aquila in battle. "How have you behaved, if I may ask?" And the dog, already happy at this overture, crawled closer, nestled against the master's leg, and looked up at him with his shiny and beseeching eyes. For a good while, Tobias gazed down at the humble creature with wordless condescension. But then, feeling the poignant warmth of the body on his leg, he picked Esau up. "Well, I'll take pity on you," said Tobias. And when the good animal started licking his face, the master suddenly turned utterly compassionate and melancholy. He hugged the dog with painful love, his eyes filled with tears, and unable to complete the sentence, he repeated several times in a choked voice, "Look, you're my only. Then he carefully put Esau on the sofa, sat down next to the dog, propped his chin on his hand, and gazed at Esau with mild, silent eyes. Tobias Mindernickel now left the house more seldom than ever, for he did not wish to appear in public with Esau. He focused all his attention on him. Indeed, from morning till evening he was occupied with nothing but feeding him, wiping his eyes, giving him orders, scolding him, and talking to him in a very human way. However, the fact was that Esau did not always behave to his master's satisfaction. When the puppy lay next to him on the sofa, and drowsy for lack of air and freedom gazed at him with mournful eyes, Tobias was utterly content. He sat there, quiet and amiable, compassionately stroking Esau's back and saying, "Are you looking at me in pain, my poor friend? Yes, yes, the world is sad. You're learning that too, young as you are." At other times the animal was tremendously frisky. Blind and crazy with desire to play and hunt, he scurried around the room, tussled with a slipper, jumped on the chairs, and rolled over and over. From a distance, Tobias would watch those movements with an ugly smile of annoyance and a helpless, grudging, and uncertain gaze. Eventually he summoned Esau in a surly tone and snapped, "Stop being so exuberant! There is no reason to dance around." Once it even happened that the dog escaped from the apartment and bounded down the stairs to the street, where he promptly began chasing a cat, eating horse droppings, and joyfully cavorting with the children. But when Tobias, to the applause and laughter of half the street, showed up with a painfully twisted face, a sad thing occurred. Taking long jumps, the dog dashed away from his master. On that day, Tobias gave him a long, ferocious beating. One day, the dog had already been his for several weeks, Tobias took a loaf of bread from the dresser drawer in order to feed Esau. Getting the large bone-handled knife that he normally used for this purpose, he stooped over and sliced off small pieces which he dropped to the floor. Esau, wild with hunger and playfulness, came, jumping over blindly, and ran into the awkwardly held knife which stabbed him under his right shoulder blade. He writhed on the floor, losing blood. Terrified, Tobias threw everything aside and bent down over the injured creature. Suddenly, however, the master's expression changed, and a shimmer of relief and happiness actually passed across his face. Gingerly, he carried the whimpering dog to the sofa, and no one can imagine with how much devotion he began tending the patient. He never left his side all day, and at night Tobias let him sleep on his own bed. He washed and bandaged him, comforted him and consoled him with indefatigable joy and concern. "Does it hurt very badly?" Tobias asked. "Yes, yes, you're suffering terribly, my poor animal, but be still. We have to endure it." When he spoke, his face was calm, mournful, and happy. But as Esau gained strength, grew cheerier, and then recovered, Tobias became more and more anxious and dissatisfied. He felt he no longer needed to worry about the injury. He would show the dog his commiseration purely through words and caresses. The healing was quite advanced. Esau had a sound constitution. He was already getting about the room, and one day, after slurping up a dish of milk and white bread, he bounded from the sofa, completely mended. With joyful yelps, and as unrestrained as ever, he went scurrying through the 2 rooms, tugging at the bed cover, chasing a potato, and rolling over and over in sheer delight. Tobias was at the window, by the flower pot, with both hands sticking out, long and skinny from his thoroughly frayed sleeves. As one hand mechanically twisted the hair that deeply covered his forehead, his figure loomed, black and bizarre, against the gray wall of the next house. His face was pale and distorted with grief, and with an envious, embarrassed, and nasty squint, he motionlessly eyed the dog as he sprang around. Suddenly, Tobias pulled himself together, walked over to the puppy, stopped him, and slowly took him in his arms. "My poor animal," he began in a woebegone voice. But Esau, exuberant and in no mood to be treated like that, snapped friskily at the hand that tried to stroke him, twisted out of Tobias's arms, executed a mischievous side leap, began yelping again, and cheerily dashed away. What happened now was so inexplicable and frightful that I refuse to describe it in detail. Tobias Mindernickel stood bending forward, his arms dangling down his body, his lips squeezing together, his eyeballs trembling dreadfully in their sockets. Then, with a kind of frenzied pounce, he grabbed the animal. A large, shiny object flashed in his hand, and with a gash running from the right shoulder and plunging deep into his chest, Esau collapsed on the floor. He emitted no sound. He simply fell on his side, bleeding and shuddering. An instant later he was lying on the sofa, and Tobias was kneeling in front of him, pressing a cloth on the injury and stammering, "My poor animal, my poor animal, how sad everything is, how sad we both are. Are you suffering? Yes, yes, I know you're suffering. How pathetically you're lying before me. But I'm here with you. I'm comforting you. I'll use my best handkerchief. However, Esau just lay there, his throat rattling, his dimmed and quizzical eyes filled with innocence, lament, and incomprehension were fixed on his master, and then he stretched his legs out slightly and died. But Tobias remained frozen where he was. He had put his head on Esau's body and was weeping bitterly.
This ends Tobias Mindernickel.